What I'm going to talk to you about is work I've been doing trying to understand human cooperation. Cooperation is, on the one hand, totally essential for everything in life, from the functioning of the cells in our body, through our friendships and personal relationships, our professional relationships and management of organizations, and global level issues like conservation and climate change. What all these things have in common is their non-zero sum, which is to say everyone's better off when everyone cooperates. But at the same time, cooperation is challenging because it often requires individuals to bear personal costs in order to create those collective benefits. So what I do in my work is I try and understand, first of all, why people are, by and large, willing to cooperate by combining formal models using game theory and computer simulations with behavioral experiments where you have people make real decisions involving real money. And then I try and to apply those things that we find in the real world to actually promote cooperation, both by spreading our findings to the general public and by working in collaboration with lots of government and non-government organizations to apply our findings. Okay, so the question is, what makes people willing to cooperate? And part of that answer is that much of the time, it's actually in your long-run self-interest to be cooperative. So for example, if people interact repeatedly, then if I cooperate with you today, that will make you more inclined to cooperate with me tomorrow. Or say we only interact once, but a third party is observing us, then if I cooperate with you, it might make the third party more likely to cooperate with me. Zooming out a little bit, if you take into account the fact that our interactions aren't random, but are structured by these social interaction networks, then if you realize that being a cooperative person such that you help the people that you're connected to, that makes you a desirable interaction partner. People will want to connect to you, and you'll gain social capital. And zooming out even further, when you engage in cooperative acts that benefit the large groups or even the whole planet, like reducing your energy use, then if that behavior is observable by the people that you interact with on a daily basis, then that can make them more likely to cooperate with you in the context of your personal relationships. So what all these different things boil down to is the idea that when future consequences exist for your present behavior, then it can actually, in the long run, pay off to be cooperative, because paying the cost of cooperating today results in receiving benefits in the future. And this kind of strategic cooperation is really important and I think explains a large fraction of the cooperation that we observe in the world. But it's still, there's a huge amount of evidence that even when you take away all of this, any kind of strategic incentive, and you still have one-shot anonymous interactions, still people are very often willing to pay costs to benefit others. And so I'm interested in understanding this kind of really altruistic cooperation, and in particular trying to understand it from a cognitive perspective. And to do so, I use this thing called the dual process framework that came out of cognitive psychology, social psychology, behavioral economics, that thinks of decision-making as arising from two different kinds of cognitive processes. On the one hand, you have careful deliberation that is well attuned to all of the details of the problem that you're facing, but requires time and cognitive effort. And I'm going to represent deliberative processes with my son Isaac, who 1 hour after he was born was carefully considering the world in which he found himself. So this is most of what people think about when they think about decision making. But there's a lot of evidence that also often people use decision processes that are not sort of rational and deliberative like this, but are more intuitive, gut feelings, maybe emotional responses. So there's things that are fast and easy and automatic, but as a trade-off are less sensitive to the details of the exact situation that they're facing. And I'm going to represent intuitive processes with Isaac's identical twin brother, Miles, who was less attentive to what is going on around him. So when you apply this frame of deliberation versus intuition to cooperation, you see sort of two possible kinds of stories. On the one hand, it might be that we have greedy impulses, but it's through self-control that we're able to do the right thing and say, no, I really should be cooperative. Or it might be that we're intuitively predisposed to cooperate, and then when we stop and think about it, we get selfish. And most people tend to endorse this idea that we are, by default, selfish. But I want to think from a theoretical perspective, what should we actually expect? And in order to answer that question, you have to think about what are intuitions and what shapes what is intuitive. And there's a lot of evidence across a lot of domains that behavior that is typically long-run optimal, so things that typically work out well, wind up getting internalized or automatized as your default responses, these sort of social heuristics or rules of thumb for social behavior. It makes sense that your default should be the thing that typically works well. But then if you stop and deliberate, you might realize, right now I'm in a situation that's atypical, and so my normal rule of thumb doesn't actually make sense in this situation. And if you apply this lens to cooperation and to what I was just talking about in the first part of my talk, if I'm arguing that typically future consequences exist for your behavior, such that it's in your long-run interest to cooperate, then that suggests that your intuitive default should be to cooperate, because cooperation is the thing that usually works out well for you. But then, if you find yourself in a situation where there's not much in the way of future consequences, and you actually could take advantage of someone and get away with it, then if you deliberate, you should realize, here's an atypical situation where actually my sort of emotional or intuitive desire to help other people is not actually going to steer me in the right direction in terms of personal maximization. So from this perspective, we should expect in these one-shot anonymous interactions that intuition favors cooperation while deliberation makes you more selfish. And to provide some empirical evidence in support of this theory, I've run a bunch of different experiments that have this general structure. So here we take 4 people. They all simultaneously make a decision. We're just going to look at one from one person's perspective, but all 4 of them are making this same decision. They get some money. They choose whether to keep it for themselves or to contribute it to the public good, in which case it gets doubled, representing the non-zero-sum nature of cooperation, and then evenly split among everyone. And so this makes the group as a whole better off, but this person that contributed their money has less than if they just kept all the money for themselves. So it captures this tension between what's good for the individual and what's good for the group. And so then what we do is we have people give people real money, have them make this decision, and half of them, we force them to rely more on intuition by saying, please decide as quickly as possible. You have to decide in less than 10 seconds. And the other half, we make them more deliberative. We say, please carefully consider your decision. You have to stop and think for at least 10 seconds before you make your choice. And the question is then, what is the average amount contributed to the public good in these two different conditions? And what you see both with a general population recruited online and with undergrads in the lab, that people that we force to rely more on intuition contribute significantly more than people that we ask to stop and carefully consider their decision. And we've shown this to be true in various different situations. There's a couple of large meta-analyses out there supporting these results. And so this is offering evidence in support of this idea that intuition implements the typically advantageous behavior, whereas deliberation switches you towards what's actually payoff maximizing in the specific situation that you're facing. And we have some follow-up experiments where we expose people to a set of rules that makes cooperation pay off or to a set of rules that make selfishness pay off. They sort of habituate to cooperating or defecting for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we show that results in them being significantly more altruistic in the case of people that got used to cooperative, or more selfish in the case of people that got used to being uncooperative in subsequent interactions with different random other people. So they sort of, your experiences shape your subsequent behavior. So to summarize, what I've argued is that your intuitive responses implement behaviors that are typically optimal, and that when future consequences for behavior exist, that makes cooperation the optimal behavior. And so the implication of this is that good institutions, good sets of rules that sort of incentivize people to behave well and to cooperate with each other, not only do they force people to cooperate in the situations that the institution applies to, but they can actually create cultures of cooperation, lead people to internalize cooperation as their default response that then they apply more generally, even beyond the reach of these institutions. So these are the people that I cooperate with most often. My lab at Yale. If you're interested in any of this kind of stuff, all my papers are on my website for free. Send me an email, come by, and let's cooperate. Thanks.